Nothing in these remote landscapes warned these people that ordinary days would dissolve into moments of raw terror. From the pre-dawn chaos of a grizzly tearing through a Wyoming RV park to the fatal Arctic ambush that crushed a snowmobile expedition, in this video you'll witness 6 stories that show how quickly nature can turn unforgiving, trapping people in high-stakes battles for survival. The night of December 1st, 2025, settled over the remote Wyoming RV campground with a deep, weighted stillness that came only when the cold pressed hard against the timberline. Nothing in the darkness hinted at the violent chain of events about to unfold, events that would leave families stunned by how quickly a sense of safety could collapse when a single starving wild animal, driven beyond its limits by an early and punishing winter, moved into human space in search of anything it could eat. In one of the trailers at the far edge of the grounds slept Luke Harper, a 37-year-old mechanic who valued these quiet winter trips, along with his partner Maya Collins, who had insisted they keep their tradition alive despite worsening storms. Their children, Sophie, 8, and Max, 6, had drifted to sleep beside a tower of board games after begging for one more round, unaware of the danger prowling through the frozen dark. The massive grizzly, forced down from the high ridges, wandered between the trees with frantic hunger, its ribs showing beneath its thick winter coat. Each breath rose in heavy white plumes as it followed faint traces of food drifting from coolers, trash bins, and the remnants of campfires. Weeks of scarce forage and deep early snow had worsened its desperation, trapping smaller game out of reach and draining the energy it needed to remain cautious. Now, instinct had taken over completely. It moved through the last line of pines, stepped into the edge of the campground, and without slowing, rammed its weight against a nearby trailer. The impact echoed like a gunshot through the frozen clearing. Inside, Luke snapped awake as the aluminum siding crumpled inward with a metallic scream, the whole trailer rocking as if struck by a vehicle. Maya grabbed the children, pulling them close as blankets slid to the floor. Another brutal shove sent dishes crashing from the kitchenette. The bear's claws tore at the siding in frantic sweeps, ripping long strips of metal and insulation free. When it slammed its body into the trailer again, the impact toppled a small propane stove and sent it tumbling into a campfire pit outside that had been left faintly smoldering earlier in the night when Luke assumed the dying embers were harmless. The overturned stove broke open, and a burst of flame flared to life as propane hissed from the damaged cylinder, igniting the dry wood and the blankets that had fallen nearby. The sudden blaze lit the interior in flashes of violent orange. Outside, startled campers shouted as the fire spread along the ground, feeding on brittle winter debris and sending burning embers skittering across the ice-packed paths between the rows of trailers. The Grizzly, further agitated by firelight, noise, and the acrid smell of burning fuel, charged toward another RV and slammed its weight into the side. A window cracked under the force, and a cooler popped open, scattering food containers across the ground. People ran in every direction, slipping on the icy surface as they tried to reach safer ground. The bear barreled between vehicles with wild desperation, smashing folding chairs, bins, and anything else in its way. Luke seized a fire extinguisher mounted near the door and shoved aside a piece of torn siding, pushing his family toward a reinforced metal shed built for emergency storage. Its heavy walls were designed to withstand harsh winter storms. He could only hope they would withstand the chaos now tearing through the campground. Maya kept Sophie and Max close as they crossed the slippery ground, sparks rising behind them from burning blankets and scattered debris. A few seconds later, the spreading fire reached a gas can that had tipped near a neighboring trailer. The ignition erupted in a brief explosion, lighting the sky and knocking several people off their feet. The blast sent the bear skidding sideways, disoriented as a wave of pressure rolled outward in a cloud of smoke and flaming debris. The air thickened with the sharp scent of propane, melted plastic, and scorched pine needles. Luke put himself between the shed and the approaching bear, gripping a flare gun pulled from the emergency kit. His hands shook in the numbing cold, but he steadied his breath as the bear reared back, releasing a roar that vibrated through the frozen ground. He fired the flare. A streak of red arced through the night, hissing as it burst near the bear's shoulder and filled the clearing with harsh, pulsing light. The animal recoiled, stumbling backward as the flare burned against the snow. After a moment of disoriented hesitation, it turned and lumbered toward the timberline, disappearing among the trees as embers drifted slowly to the ground. With dawn came a pale, cold light that revealed the full scope of the destruction. Several trailers looked as though they had been struck by heavy machinery. Metal siding hung in twisted sheets. Windows were shattered, tires lay slashed open, and furniture was scattered across the snow. Wisps of smoke curled from smoldering debris where emergency crews continued to cool hotspots. Families stood clustered near the reinforced shed and along the safer paths, their faces drained by exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. Conversations were hushed, movements slow, as though the fragile quiet might shatter again with the slightest sound. What remained of the campground bore the marks of a night in which hunger, winter, and instinct had collided. The place that had been chosen for peace and tradition had shown, without hesitation, how quickly the wilderness could turn violent when pushed too far by cold and scarcity. And for those who survived the long night, the memory would remain a stark reminder of the thin line that separated tranquility from chaos in the depths of winter. The Arctic morning of March 14, 2023, rose in a pale wash of light that barely warmed the endless stretch of ice, and nothing across that remote plain hinted at the violence that would soon break the familiar rhythm of fieldwork. Dr. Claire Dawson, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist known for her precise and disciplined research, traveled ahead on her snowmobile, guiding it across the frozen tundra while the wind pushed long ribbons of snow across her tracks. Behind her rode Ethan Ward, 29, her capable and determined assistant, who had joined the expedition eager to prove himself in unforgiving conditions. Their mission had been months in planning, aimed at gathering data on seal populations before late-season storms made travel nearly impossible. They moved with the steady efficiency of researchers accustomed to harsh environments and believed the day would pass like the ones before it, quiet, controlled, and predictable beneath the vast Arctic sky. The scent of packed food, fuel, and equipment drifted across the ice, carried by a shifting wind. That faint but distinct odor traveled farther than either researcher realized, reaching the nose of a massive polar bear trekking across a low ridge to the west. The bear had spent days wandering a region where young seal breathing holes had frozen earlier than usual, leaving it with few opportunities to feed. Hunger had stripped away its caution, sharpening its instincts to a dangerous edge. It lifted its head again, catching the scent with renewed intensity, and its posture tightened as its focus narrowed on the distant shapes moving across the white horizon. With deliberate purpose, it started down the ridge, spreading its weight across the snow with each step. Claire rode ahead without noticing the shadow that had paused high above on the ridge. She scanned the broad expanse for seal trails, her snowmobile gliding smoothly across hardened ice. Ethan followed at a comfortable distance, concentrating on the equipment strapped to the back of his sled and mentally reviewing the next portion of the survey route. He believed that their greatest threat that day came from hidden fissures beneath the ice near the coast, not from anything moving over the surface. The bear made its decision in a sudden burst of power that would have been impressive even under normal circumstances. Its muscles bunched, and then it charged down the slope with enormous strength, gravity accelerating its already tremendous speed. The sound of its approach merged with the rising wind, and neither Claire nor Ethan heard anything until the predator was nearly upon them. Ethan turned his head instinctively at the shift of motion behind him, catching only a fleeting blur of white before the full force of the charging bear slammed into the side of his snowmobile with the crushing impact of a heavy vehicle striking metal. The collision twisted the sled sideways, launching it across the ice. Ethan was thrown from his seat, hitting the ground with a hard, jarring thud as the snowmobile skidded behind him. Before he could move, the momentum carried the machine into his body. It toppled violently, crashing down across his torso as the ice beneath him groaned and crackled under the added pressure. The bear roared, driven by a frantic desperation, and tore into the wreckage with a ferocity fueled by hunger and adrenaline. Claire heard the crash behind her, immediately turning her snowmobile as dread surged through her. She spotted Ethan pinned beneath the overturned sled, while the bear clawed at the metal frame, each swipe forcing the heavy machine deeper into the snow. She accelerated without hesitation, her thoughts racing through emergency procedures that suddenly felt inadequate in the face of the raw, overwhelming force unfolding only meters away. The bear continued to smash down on the snowmobile, its claws scraping metal and its weight shifting violently, causing Ethan's trapped body to jolt with each impact. Claire steered in a wide arc to draw the bear's focus, her snowmobile kicking up a spray of ice crystals that glittered under the pale Arctic light. The bear lifted its massive head and released a deep, guttural snarl, momentarily abandoning the wreckage. Claire seized the brief opening and reached for the flare pistol strapped beside her seat. Although the cold made her hands tremble, she steadied the weapon and fired upward. The flare streaked into the sky and burst open in a harsh, brilliant flare of red that reflected across the ice and lit the scene in a stark, crimson glow. The bear recoiled at the sudden brightness, roaring as it backed away. Claire fired a second flare, and this additional burst of color and sound finally drove the predator into retreat. It turned, lumbering across the plain with long, powerful strides until it disappeared beyond a distant ridge. Silence settled almost instantly, deep enough to swallow even the wind for a moment. Claire guided her snowmobile to a stop and ran to Ethan's side, dropping to her knees beside the wreckage. She fought to lift the snowmobile's frame, her gloves slipping on metal chilled by the Arctic air. Her breath came in fast, uneven bursts as she radioed for emergency assistance, giving their location and describing the severity of the situation. She knew even as she spoke that the crushing force Ethan had endured left little hope. The minutes stretched into long, frozen hours. Claire remained beside him, the wind sweeping mournfully across the stark plain as the sky dimmed toward early Arctic dusk. When rescue teams finally arrived, their snowmobiles cutting new tracks across untouched snow, they moved with practiced solemnity, lifting the ruined sled and recovering Ethan's body from beneath it. The white landscape remained eerily still, the tracks of the retreating polar bear already fading under drifting snow. The emptiness around them underscored the finality of what had unfolded, a stark reminder of how swiftly the Arctic could become fatal when hunger, isolation, and unforgiving terrain converged in a single devastating moment. The cold afternoon of October 22, 2023, settled heavily over the glacial river winding through the Kodiak wilderness, its surface half frozen and scattered with thick slabs of ice drifting slowly along the pale green current. Nothing in that stillness hinted at the sudden violence about to erupt across the valley, a moment that would leave two experienced hunters shaken by how quickly the land could shift from quiet to peril. Evan Mercer, 38, a seasoned hunter who had spent years learning the patterns of Alaska's great brown bears, and Tyler Briggs, 34, a paramedic who hunted during the fall for the Challenge in Solitude, had tracked a bull moose since morning. Wide hoofprints cut along gravel bars and through alder thickets, while low clouds pressed against the peaks, creating a dim gray curtain over the mountains. The river beside them churned with meltwater from higher glaciers, its temperature close to freezing even before winter fully tightened its grip. Both men knew the risk of crossing so late in the season, yet the moose trail led directly across the water, and fading daylight urged them onward. They studied the channels carefully, choosing a narrow point where the ice seemed stable enough to blunt the current and where submerged rocks formed a rough stepping path beneath the surface. The wind carried the sharp scent of approaching snow from the ridge, but it also carried something else, an unfamiliar heaviness, though neither man recognized it as the sign of a predator close by. Unseen behind a bend in the river, a massive Kodiak bear waited in the shallow rapids. Its fur clung in wet, heavy layers from repeated but unsuccessful attempts to snatch lingering late-season salmon. Frustration grew with each failed lunge. When it caught the distant crunch of human footsteps shifting over ice, its instincts tightened instantly. Hunger had forced boldness into its movements, and the narrowing twist of the river offered shelter and opportunity. The bear sank lower, half concealed behind a snow-dusted fallen log wedged between boulders, watching the approaching hunters without a sound. Evan moved first, testing each foothold as ice shifted under his weight, the river roaring beneath in deep, hollow booms as water slid under frozen shelves. Tyler followed several steps behind, glancing toward the far bank where the moose tracks continued into a stand of spruce. The moment they reached the halfway point, the bear surged from the rapids with a roar that echoed off the valley walls, sending a sheet of frigid water spraying upward as it barreled toward the crossing with startling speed. Evan froze for a heartbeat, stunned by the sudden eruption of movement only yards away. Seeking advantage, the bear lunged toward the fallen log beside it. With a single swipe of its massive paw, it struck the log and sent it spinning across the water like a thrown battering ram. The heavy trunk slammed into Evan's legs with brutal force, knocking him off his footing and hurling him backward into the river. Icy water swallowed him in a violent rush, biting into his lungs so sharply he gasped involuntarily, drawing in a mouthful of freezing water. The current seized him and dragged him downstream toward a cluster of submerged rocks. He slammed against one with a painful jolt that shot through his ribs. His limbs felt thick and sluggish in the freezing water, muscles seizing from the cold as he fought to keep his head above the surface. Upstream, the bear clawed at the drifting log, roaring in agitation as it circled through the shallows. Its eyes tracked both men, shifting rapidly as it worked to determine which target or opportunity it should pursue. Tyler, standing on a slick sheet of ice near the river's edge, scrambled to the bank, adrenaline narrowing his focus. His boots slipped over frost-coated stones as he grabbed for anything he could throw to divert the bear's attention. He tore off his backpack, heavy with gear and food, and hurled it into the rapids where the bear circled in frenzied patterns. The pack splashed down and drifted toward the predator. The bear snapped at it instinctively, jaws clamping around the fabric as it tested the unfamiliar object, momentarily distracted by the scent stored inside. That hesitation gave Evan one chance. He clawed at the rocks beside him, dragging himself onto a partially submerged boulder as his soaked clothes pulled at his body with numbing weight. Every movement burned with the deep ache of cold. Inch by inch, he pulled himself toward the shallows where the current eased, his entire body shaking so violently he struggled to stay upright. Equipment from his belt had been torn free in the water, and farther downstream he watched one of their rifles vanish beneath a drifting sheet of ice. Tyler reached him quickly, gripping his arm and helping him onto firmer ground while keeping his eyes fixed on the bear. The animal finally released the backpack, letting it drift downstream as it snorted in frustration. Instead of resuming its charge, it paced toward the tree line, its massive shoulders shifting beneath wet fur as it assessed the situation with the cautious intelligence characteristic of its species. It glanced once more at the two shivering men, then turned and disappeared into the shadowed spruce forest, leaving the river to reclaim its silence. The hunters collapsed onto the frozen gravel, breathing hard, their bodies bruised and clothes soaked through, the cold settling deep into their bones as they gathered what gear remained. Much of their equipment, firearms, ammunition, tools, had been scattered across the rapids or lost beneath drifting ice, leaving them with only what remained on their belts. The valley felt painfully quiet after the chaos, the only sound the steady churn of the river that had nearly claimed Evan's life. As they began the long, shivering hike back toward camp, both men felt the weight of the encounter settle heavily over them. A stark reminder that in the Kodiak wilderness, survival depended not only on strength or experience, but on timing, instinct, and the fragile luck that determined whether a predator pressed its attack or slipped into the forest, leaving adrenaline and disbelief lingering in its wake. The night of January 18, 2024, settled heavily over the remote forests of Russia's Amur region, a cold so deep it seemed to freeze the air itself. Alexei Volkov, 41, a forestry worker who had grown up navigating the harsh eastern wilderness, and his wife Natalia, 39, a skilled hunter familiar with the dangers of the taiga, settled into the aging wooden cabin they had brought their children to for what was meant to be a quiet winter hunting weekend. They never imagined that the darkness outside concealed a starving predator that had already spent hours circling unseen. Their children, Sasha, 12, and Mila, 8, had fallen asleep beneath heavy blankets while the wind rattled the shutters, and the family believed the night would pass quietly, despite the faint unease Alexei had felt after noticing displaced snow tracks near the tree line earlier that afternoon. Unbeknownst to them, a massive Russian grizzly, weakened and emboldened by months of poor salmon runs and dwindling food sources, had been moving in wide circles around the cabin. The faint but unmistakable scent of stored meat stacked in the small shed attached to the structure drew it again and again. Hunger gnawed at the bear's instincts, stripping away the natural caution that normally kept it distant from human dwellings. As the temperature dropped further, the scent sharpened in the still air. The bear pressed its nose against the wind, pacing with restless frustration, before finally deciding to act with the desperation of a predator pushed to its limits. Inside the cabin, the wood-burning stove crackled softly while Alexei prepared to sleep. Though lingering tension made him pause near the window, trying to read the darkness beyond the frosted glass. The silence outside felt too absolute, the kind of stillness that often preceded sudden danger in the wild. He forced himself to dismiss the feeling, believing the cabin's thick logs would keep them safe through the night. Natalia slept lightly, her hunting rifle propped near the bed, while the children curled together in the loft above, unaware of the predator inching closer with every second. When the attack came, it was explosive and immediate. The grizzly hurled itself against the side of the cabin with violent strength, the wooden wall cracking inward as shards of splintered logs burst into the room. The bear's massive head and shoulders tore through the structure. Snow poured inside through the opening, and the cold rushed in behind it as it roared, driven by the overwhelming scent of meat permeating the interior. Stored food, cooking remnants, and even clothing in the entryway created a scent trail strong enough to override every instinct except the drive to feed. Alexei reacted instantly, lunging toward the emergency supply box near the stove, where he kept a flare gun for unexpected situations. He grabbed a flare and ignited it, the bright orange glow filling the room. He threw the burning signal toward the bear, which skidded across the wooden floor and erupted in sparks that momentarily startled the predator. The bear reared back, confused by the sudden light, but the reaction lasted only seconds before it pressed deeper into the room, claws tearing furrows into the floorboards as it advanced toward the stored meat. Natalia seized her rifle, moving with sharp, practiced efficiency, but the bear's sheer size and momentum overwhelmed the narrow space. It slammed its weight into the broken wall again, widening the gap and sending debris crashing across the floor. The impact knocked Natalia off balance, and the rifle clattered under a fallen timber. Still driven by hunger and panic, the bear surged forward once more, its powerful shoulder knocking Alexei aside and sending him sprawling near the stove, where embers spilled across a pile of wood shavings used earlier for kindling. The shavings ignited instantly, flames licking upward as sparks spread across the floor. The fire caught faster than either adult could react, smoke curling toward the ceiling and mixing with the frigid air rushing through the shattered wall. Alexei urged Natalia to move toward the side door. She grabbed Mila first, pressing the little girl into her arms while reaching for Sasha, who had scrambled halfway down the loft ladder in confusion. The children's terrified movements added to the chaos as the bear advanced again, breaking furniture beneath its weight and smashing the table into splinters. The family rushed toward the side exit, but the bear lunged across the room in a burst of force, slamming its massive body into the door just as they reached it. The impact crushed the frame inward, wooden planks splitting under pressure, sealing the only escape route and trapping them in a tightening circle of fire, smoke, and destruction. Flames spread along the floor, driven by drafts created by the shattered wall, and embers drifted upward toward the loft where Sasha had retreated in terror. In the last chaotic moments, Natalia tried to shield the children, while Alexei attempted to push debris aside to reach the rifle still buried beneath fallen logs. The bear surged again, frantic and disoriented in the smoke-filled cabin. Heat intensified, and the combination of flames and the raging animal turned the interior into a collapsing, lethal maze where each second narrowed the family's chances of survival. Sasha, driven by instinct, scrambled into the loft and grabbed snow-covered tarps his father had laid out earlier to dry. He dragged them over himself, pressing into the farthest corner beneath the low roof, using the frozen fabric to mask his scent while smoke drifted upward. The roar of the bear filled the cabin, merging with splintering wood, collapsing beams, and the crackling fire into a terrifying blur. He stayed perfectly still, trembling beneath the heavy tarp as chaos raged below him. Hours passed before rescuers reached the remote cabin, alerted by a distress signal Alexei had managed to trigger earlier in the night. They arrived to find the structure partially collapsed, smoke still rising from the ruined walls. The massive bear lay dead outside, having finally succumbed to the fire and its own injuries. Inside, only Sasha survived, curled beneath the tarp, shivering violently but alive. His survival later became one of the most haunting accounts of courage and devastating loss in the history of the Amur wilderness. Hannah and Luke Reynolds had hiked deep into the remote mountain wilderness in early winter 2022. Hoping the secluded hot springs hidden beneath snow-dusted cliffs would offer a quiet escape from the constant noise of their busy lives. When they stepped into the clearing shortly after midday, a rare sense of calm settled around them. Rising steam drifted slowly into the pale sky, while ice-rimmed boulders surrounded the pools like natural walls, creating the impression of a protected and forgotten place. After the long hike, their muscles ached and legs trembled with fatigue. The contrast between the frigid air and the heat rising from the mineral water made the springs look impossibly inviting. They set their backpacks in the snow and eased into the steaming pool, letting the warmth wrap around them as their breath formed drifting clouds that spiraled upward before dissolving into the cold air above. For a long, peaceful stretch of minutes, nothing moved except the faint swirl of steam and the slow shifting of nearby branches weighed down with fresh frost. The couple felt tension fade as the quiet of the mountains enveloped them, leaving them unaware that the scent of food left earlier by hikers lingered in the area, carried softly through the trees. Far beyond the clearing, a large black bear moved steadily through the forest, drawn forward by the familiar smells of trail mix, snacks, and sweat-soaked clothing. Hunger sharpened its focus, intensified by the early snowfalls that had limited natural forage before winter fully locked the landscape. Each slow, deliberate step brought it closer to the springs, the dark shape weaving between frozen trunks as it approached the open clearing. Hannah noticed the shape first. A shifting shadow at the edge of the tree line that at first seemed a trick of drifting steam. As the shadow separated from the trees, panic surged through her. The heavy frame and thick fur of a black bear became unmistakable through the mist. Luke felt the water ripple beside him as Hannah scrambled out, her foot slipping on ice-rimmed rock. The sharp splash alerted the bear, which turned its broad head toward them, breathing heavy and loud over the soft hiss of the hot springs. Luke instinctively reached for anything that could serve as a barrier, grabbing a thick piece of driftwood half buried in snow near the pool's edge. His hands trembled as he lifted it, while the bear stepped into the steaming water with slow, forceful strides, heat rolling off its fur as it advanced. The world compressed into a single, terrifying moment as the bear closed the distance, claws slicing through the water. When it swiped at Luke, the blow struck with startling power, tearing through his jacket and sending him sprawling across the icy ground. The cold cut through him sharply, nearly stealing his breath. Hannah watched in horror, legs trembling as she sought footing on the slippery rocks. The bear shifted its attention between them, steam wrapping around its massive form in slow, ghost-like coils. The bear then moved toward the small wooden sauna hut, built years earlier by other visitors. It tested the structure with its weight, and the force of its shove caused the thin walls to buckle and collapse. Wood splintered across the clearing, scattering leftover gear from past hikers. The sudden crash echoed sharply against the cliffs, giving Hannah just enough time to pull Luke toward a narrow rise on the far side of the clearing, a frost-covered slope strewn with loose stones that might offer a chance of escape if climbed quickly. Luke staggered to his feet, ribs aching from the impact, and followed Hannah up the incline, each step sending small avalanches of ice and dirt sliding beneath them while the bear continued to shove through the broken structure. Minutes stretched with agonizing slowness as the bear circled the lower clearing, pacing through the shallows while the destroyed hut lay in scattered pieces. Steam rose around its massive shape while Hannah and Luke crouched on the narrow slope above, trying to remain still despite shivering muscles and pounding hearts. They could hear the bear's heavy breathing and the thud of its steps as it searched among broken boards and scattered belongings. Each pause tightened Hannah's chest as she feared it would notice their movement against the pale rocks. Eventually, the bear seemed to lose interest, its hunger drawing it back toward the tree line. The wind carried faint scents of other hikers who had passed earlier that morning. After one final glance toward the pools, it turned away, its dark shape fading slowly into the forest. The clearing fell silent again, broken only by the soft bubbling of the springs and the distant creak of branches shifting under winter's weight. When the bear finally disappeared, Hannah and Luke allowed themselves to breathe, hands still shaking as they descended the slope to gather what remained of their gear. The hot springs that had felt peaceful just an hour earlier now appeared scarred and hostile. The destroyed sauna lay in fragments across the snow, and deep claw marks carved into the surrounding ice served as reminders of how quickly calm could turn into danger in the wilderness. As they collected their remaining supplies and prepared for the long hike back to the trailhead, they felt the weight of the encounter settle over them. Remote beauty offered no guarantee of safety, and even the most tranquil places could become battlegrounds when hunger and instinct intersected at the worst possible moment. On the morning of October 18th, 2025, the ranch at the edge of Wyoming's Absaroka Range felt colder and quieter than it should have for mid-autumn. As Declan Reeves rode out from the barn before sunrise, he sensed that something in the land had shifted over the past week. The disappearance of 3 calves and fresh claw marks along the southern fence line left a steady weight of dread settling between his ribs like a tightening band. Each dawn he rose earlier, searching along the perimeter, trying to catch whatever had begun testing the wire. Despite years spent working cattle in this harsh terrain, he knew instantly that the tracks pressed into the mud belonged to a grizzly larger than any he had encountered before, its stride wide and heavy, its movements bold enough to show that hunger had driven it closer to the property than usual. Fog rolled across the pastures in thick sheets, blurring fences, troughs, and grazing fields into pale outlines glowing faintly under the early light. Lily Hart rode out beside him, keeping her horse close, the low visibility making it difficult to judge distance or movement across the uneven ground. They moved slowly at first, scanning each section of the southern line for breaks in the wire. The morning air was sharp with frost, carrying the earthy scent of churned mud from low areas near the creek bed. The ranch felt muted, as though the fog had absorbed every sound except the steady rhythm of hooves pressing into the wet soil. Even the horses seemed uneasy, tossing their heads and snorting as they walked. They were halfway along the southern stretch when the sudden crack of snapping posts tore through the fog with brutal clarity. The fence shuddered violently as something massive shoved through it, and in the next heartbeat, a grizzly erupted from the broken section, mud flying from its paws and strands of wire whipping through the air. The fog parted around its charging form, revealing wide shoulders and matted fur. Lily reacted first, raising her rifle and firing a warning shot that disappeared into the mist with a hollow echo. Instead of stopping, the sharp report appeared to enrage the bear further, its roar rolling across the field as it surged forward with terrifying speed, its heavy breathing cutting through the fog like a physical force. The bear struck Declan before he could bring his horse around, slamming into his side and throwing him across the churned mud. He landed hard, the breath tearing from his chest, cold earth caking his hands as he scrambled to orient himself. Pain radiated from his ribs, the world tilting briefly as he fought to regain focus. Through the blur of fog, he saw Lily thrown backward as the bear pivoted toward her. Its weight crashed into an overturned metal trough that skidded across the ground before pinning her against the collapsed remains of a feed pallet. Tools, rope, and splintered boards scattered across the mud under the bear's massive frame. Lily fought to wedge her shoulder into a narrow gap between the trough and the ground, struggling to keep from being crushed. Their radio, clipped to the saddle Declan had lost in the chaos, lay crushed beneath the bear's first charge. Sparks flickered briefly before dying entirely, leaving them isolated at the far end of the property, with no way to call for help. Declan forced himself upright, each movement sending sharp pain through his side, and scanned the fog for anything he could use to draw the bear away from Lily. Through the shifting gray, he saw the outline of the old barn at the edge of the field, its doorway partially collapsed from years of storms. Just inside, barely visible beneath a fallen beam, he recognized the red handle of the flare gun they kept for emergencies, a tool rarely touched in normal seasons, but now potentially their only chance. The bear continued to pin Lily, front paws braced against the metal trough as it clawed at the broken boards beneath her, weight pressing the trough deeper into the mud. Fog swirled around its massive body, mixing with the steam rising from its breath, giving it an almost distorted presence, as if the land itself warped under its fury. Declan dropped to his stomach and crawled toward the barn, using fallen boards and scattered debris as intermittent cover. Each slow movement sent muted vibrations through the ground that he hoped would be lost beneath the bear's roaring and the metallic grinding of the shifting trough. The crawl felt endless, every foot of progress demanding full concentration as he moved across slick mud, broken wire, and splintered wood. The flare gun drew closer while the fog thickened again, muting the chaos behind him, but never fully masking the sounds of the battle unfolding in the clearing. When he reached the barn doorway, he slipped beneath the leaning beam, ignoring the sting of fresh cuts as he stretched his arm toward the flare gun. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the cold metal handle before closing around it with desperate force. Behind him, the bear shifted suddenly, heavy footfalls shaking the ground as it moved away from the trough for a brief moment. Its head turned sharply, as if it had caught the faint sound of Declan's movement despite the fog and its own noise. Declan pressed himself flat against the barn floor, gripping the flare gun tightly as he listened to the bear's approach. The fog was now thick enough that he could no longer distinguish its full form, only the growing volume of its breathing as it searched the clearing. He steadied himself, knowing he had only one chance to make the shot count, and waited for the shape to break through the mist, hoping the flare's burst of light and heat would drive the desperate animal back long enough to save both their lives.